You got people being taken advantage of, mostly investors taking, advantage of tenants where they get a down payment and they kick them out or they don't have sort of equity. So having a legit, area where I've done, 7 of these personally and knowing how to orchestrate these across the United States is just one thing that I feel extremely uniquely qualified to help some individuals and to legitimize it in a fair and transparent way for both sides. So that it's a win-win.
This is Internal Rate of Return with Amanda Alexander.
In today's episode, we are joined by Adam Zock. At age 32, he left his career as a civil engineer to become a full-time real estate investor and now holds 50 single-family homes across 13 different states, along with various alternative investments. I can't wait to learn a little more about what those are. We share a passion for helping parents with young kids achieve time freedom through real estate investing. Adam lives in North Dakota with his wife and 3 young kids, and I just love that he's really clear about his role as a family man with a business and not a businessman with a family. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Amanda. It was great getting to chat. And anytime I can talk about real estate and young kids, oh, I'm all in for it.
Well, this is going to be a fun time then. Before we jump into the questions, I always like to start with a check-in question. So, what is it you're feeling particularly grateful for in this moment?
So yesterday, we got the opportunity to spend a lot of time together as a family. Now, we no longer have the W-2 jobs. I get to do what we call planning a daddy-daughter date and a father-son date with my kids. So we start off with a list and they just get to write down everything that they want to do. And it's kind of the equivalent of their yes day. And so we were planning out that, and then we kind of schedule, is it going to be a Saturday or a Thursday or when that, and so they get a 4-hour chunk where they get their own time with dad. And I learned that from somebody smarter than me. Jim Shields wrote a book, the family board meeting. And so we are instituting that. And it was just fun to see their eyes light up on all the cool possibilities of swimming to ice cream, to going to a park, to all the different things that our kids are able to do. And all of that came from the waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning for 4 years in a row that eventually led to this life of freedom that we're currently at. And so it's pretty cool just to be there and kind of just be like, oh, we're kind of there, type mentality. There's still a long ways to go, but having set out the plan now 9 years ago to be able to be there is pretty cool.
That is really inspiring, and my heart is filling just thinking about the memories that your kids will have to bring into adulthood because of what you've achieved. Those simple moments, just getting ice cream with dad or even just ideating on all the things that you can do together. I unfortunately didn't grow up with those types of memories with my parents, and so just thinking about what you're setting them up for is really special and heartwarming. Thanks for sharing that. So I did study your timeline a bit. Before we even get into, I suppose, your portfolio and how you built it, would like to go way, way back and ask, how was money talked about in your upbringing?
It was a little bit interesting where we kind of had it, but I was one of 7 kids. So I had 4 brothers and 2 sisters. So we had a large family, and my dad prioritized a private education in the Catholic school system. And so, which is not an inexpensive, contribution. So we did have some trips and travels when we were younger, but early on, it was what do you deserve? What you earn. That was the mindset installation. So we were not handed out a lot of things. I had my first paper out. I worked for my dad. I worked at Burger King at $4.35 an hour. And so it was very much you get what you earn. And so it was instilling that work ethic for me early on. And I think a lot of that was when I started trading my time for money, but just to be like, hey, can I actually show up to work on time? And can I hold a steady job? And then being able to do more value proposition work was like, hey, if I just take care of your yard, how much is that worth? And it's like, ooh, then there's a little bit of stem of the entrepreneurship in there that got fueled early on.
Wow. And where were you in the sequence of your siblings? Because I'm curious if you followed the tracks of any of your older siblings or if you decided to do, the lawn care paper route or Burger King. Where are you in the sequence?
Sure. So I am number 4.
Number 4. Okay. I think instilling work ethic is so, so important. My kids are too young for me to, well, I'll take any advice on how to game plan for that. But did you see your older siblings doing something that inspired you to take the path that you took for earning dollars?
It was not as much that as it was my dad and my mom on how that structure was out. So I kind of thought that it'd be more sibling or peer pressure, but when you're because the first four of us were all boys. So
Yeah.
it was more so postulating and trying to, it's like a love-hate relationship when you got, an 8, 6, 4, and 2-year old, and then you kind of transcend up. So when I was, 14, I had a 16, 18-year-old, and then a 12-year-old brother. So we played together, we fought together, we did a lot of that, but we each kind of had our own unique thing of what we wanted to do. But as the kids got younger, I think some of that stilled in a little bit more when my parents they got married when they were 20 and 19. So very different than today's society where I had my first child when I was in my 30s. So that's a very different where I mentally, physically, probably financially in some different situations. So not that my parents were kind of getting their feet wet, but I think as the kids got older, and they probably came into a little bit more financial resources themselves. But my dad, hardcore entrepreneur, business owner, my mom was stay at home, do the nanny, then did some different childcare and working in the school system. So I got to see that a little bit, but he was definitely I'm gone at 5 o'clock in the morning and we'll maybe see him a little bit later at night. So I didn't get a whole lot of time for them. But when we did, it was a lot of games, but he was very much instilling principles and rules to make sure that we followed them.
That is so cool to hear. Are your other siblings by chance also investors?
They are not. One of them is. So I was kind of interested about that. I was like, we're all in the same household and different things. And I remember the studies of like the two twins where it's like if it's nature versus nurture. So I think it was just timing for when we grew up, maybe what colleges we went to as far as the risk and return profile. My dad got me into chess really early on. And I
Nice.
just, for some reason, took a liking to that. And that idea of delayed gratification, almost like, you can think however many moves ahead was just something I instilled in my life in a lot of different fashions where it's like, hey, if you can look 3 years ahead or 4 years ahead. So I usually wake up every morning and say, hey, where am I headed? Which can be both a good thing, but a bad thing if I'm not just grounded here and in present and, playing with my kids and focusing on what I'm doing. Cause I'm always, looking toward the future. How can I improve? How can I do something different?
That really, really resonates with me. And now just getting opened up to the investor world and seeing how many different types of moves you can make and how that might pay off later is something that my mind obsesses about. But then at the same time, I want to be present. Like that's what I want to, just be focused on playing with my kids, doing Play Doh and Legos and, not constantly thinking about the future, just being here now. So
Yeah, the
thank
book, I forget if the book's called Anti-Fragile, but when I read that one was really an eye-opening. It was like it was like some things, if you drop them, they're fragile and they break a glass ball. There's some things that bounce back like a rubber ball, but there's actually some things like your muscles that you actually have to stress or you lose them. Like if I just sat in a chair for a year, right, I would lose all my muscle strength. So they were equating that same idea to like there's some things you don't want to break, someone's bones. You want to like test them so they can bounce back. But then there's actually some things where they actually need a healthy amount of stress and struggle in their lives. And so I'm in the same thing with my kids where I'm like, sometimes I feel like you're getting, coddled, right? And it's like, okay, how do we architect some struggle in your life? So like, oh, I don't necessarily want you to be happy all the time. I want you to be able to be resilient. And so those are
yes.
some, character traits I'm trying to instill in our kids, which is, of course, always like a 50-50 guess on if I'm, doing the right thing because I feel like there's so many parenting books and other things that you can do on there. But just applying the wisdom of those that have gone before us and just reading a lot of books on the subject.
I love it. Thank you for that recommendation, Anti-Fragile, I'll look it up. Well, speaking of being resilient or just, maybe needing to problem solve or have some struggle, can you tell me about a time when you had just a really low amount in your bank account and what your mindset was at that time?
When you get a withdrawal penalty, that's like never a fun thing. And it's like for all the strengths that I have, if you've read like the book Rocket Fuel, where I'm a visionary, I like to take risks, I like to do all those different things. But having a like just a penalty for like you don't have enough money, there's like multiple things. No one likes paying fees. And then the second part is like, oh, what did I really do wrong? And so I wouldn't say that I was ever like when I was in college, like you realize when you're spending like on a credit card, you're like, oh, it's kind of free money, but then it actually pulls out at the first of every month where you're kind of like on borrowed time. And so I feel like I've always been financially stable in that regard, where it wasn't like I'm taking on this huge debt, but there was definitely some times where it's like, hey, do you know, like you kind of forget that when you're taking out this debt, and it's always like you can justify it as an investment, right? But the investments don't necessarily pay off as quick as what you would want. So for me, personal development and me investing in myself, it's a good thing. But you could, of course, if you put $1 million into personal investment when you can't, financially afford it. And so kind of doing that strategic bet on where that is. But I had a local credit union get pulled on a bank account that I wasn't necessarily like planning for. And I was like, it turns out I probably have too many bank accounts, too many different things, but it was like, you know what, this fund was set up to do X, Y, or Z, and it's not doing that, which is a little bit of a hit to the ego. But there wasn't like the moment where I was like, you know what, I'm $50,000 in debt and doing these other, different things. It was always kind of training to me early on, like if you don't have the money, don't spend it. And so never really truly got into too much debt other than just strategic mortgage debt.
That is so important. I was just listening to, I think, Erica Kolberg, and they were talking about how if you have credit card debt, you maybe shouldn't be thinking about investing yet, like knock away at that credit card debt because 20%, you're not going to see 20% returns on whatever investment you're picking. So, you need to understand those percentages and act accordingly. And so many people are like, well, not so many, but some folks may be like, I have a low credit score and yet I'm going to start flipping houses. And it's like, well, if you can't manage your own budget yet, then maybe you shouldn't be, messing around with these types of transactions.
Yeah, before you can get through, other financials, the personal financial, I mean, it's personal for a reason, right? When you have your personal finances in order, that usually allows you some social capital to then raise capital from others. Because like, oh, at least this person's got their own financial house in order.
Yeah, absolutely. So before investing in real estate, you were a civil engineer. And can you tell us a little more about what that was like and then what motivated you to start investing in real estate?
Yeah, I designed water treatment facilities, which wasn't initially what I got into, but my professor said, "Hey, there's a job in environmental engineering. You shouldn't have an issue." So I graduated in 2010, got a job, and I've only worked for one engineering company. So I worked from 2010 to roughly 2020, and then went part-time slowly after that, which happened to be during COVID, doing part-time, and then eventually segued into doing real estate full-time. But the idea was I was good at math and science, but it turns out I was more of a business development individual than I was a technician. And so what was super frustrating is when I got my first job and all I was doing was watching pipe get put in the ground for like 12 hours a day. And I was like, oh, I went to school for 4 years and this is what I'm doing. And it was like, all right, well, I'm probably just going to play on my phone with fantasy sports, try to do some like day trading, like mental escape, because I was like, this is like crushing my soul. Like there's no mental stimulation here. And part of it was like, okay, well, am I just being lazy? Am I not like actually absorbing myself into work? And so there was probably the first 3 to 4 years where there was a lot of struggle and tension going on there. And I think a lot of it too was probably playing more of the victim card of like, right, like, hey, like, why can't they do this? Why can't they do that? And then I read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, like 3 years into my engineering career. And that was the big game changer for me, which was like, all right, turns out I'm the only one in control of my happiness. There's a lot of events, but I get to control my response. And then that's going to be the outcome. So I can't control all the events, but I can certainly control my responses. And so just that very basic, like personal development 101, which was like, yeah, just control what you can control. And I get to respond to whatever life events happens. I was like, okay, so if I was going to be happy in my job, what would I be doing? So then it started with like, oh, start taking people at work to lunch. So I'd like buy the CEO, the CFO, like lunches, or I tried to. Most of the time they buy, but they're like, who's this, engineer one trying to buy me lunch? But it was just getting in the brains of people that were wealthy, successful, and have done well in their career. And it turns out that they actually enjoyed their job, which was something that I felt was very intriguing, because I was like, you actually like this. Well, it turns out the higher level you typically get in an organization, you're maybe working more with people. You're not doing as much technical stuff, but you still have to learn all of the trades. So, part of it's like kind of paying your due. But I think for me, my foot was like, man, I just don't know if I want to do this. So that's when it like the seeds of doubt started going in my head, where it was like, okay, it was college for 4 years to get a good job. Now it's like, okay, now work 20 years, 40 years, and then you'll retire. And I was like, oh, so now I'm waiting 40 years to like have happiness. I was like, there's no way. So I either have to learn how to like my job or I got to get out of my job. Those were really the only two options. And so I ended up doing both. It was get into sales and engineering, which was a little bit different from an engineer not wanting, even though I was good at math and science, I actually enjoyed selling things and doing other stuff. So it's like kind of a lateral move. But once I found that within my engineering career and going to city council meetings or talking about big projects or designing water treatment facilities, I actually started to like that a lot better. And then I became a lot valuable within the organization. And so they were super helpful. The engineering firm that I worked for, that was like, I got nothing but good things to say about them. It was like, they cared about employees, they cared about people, but really it took me to have the initiative. And it doesn't always work out this way. I was like, hey, I want to do more of that and less of this. Some employers might be like, too bad, you signed up for this and this is your workload and this is what brings in the bill. So sometimes you don't just get to do everything that you want to do. But there is, I think, enough leeway if you're like, hey, I enjoy doing this. And if you're good at it, boy, your return on investment to the business can be super helpful to your employer. If I'm like, hey, I want to go bring in new business, they're like, oh, who would ever say no to that, right? And so I think sometimes we think that we're really good at bringing something valuable to the company, but there's higher ups that maybe don't see the same way. And so you have to maybe have that delicate balance. But I think I started sowing the seeds of doubt within the first few years. So then I bought an investment property. And then when I bought my first one, I was like, oh, this is it. I've heard bigger pockets. Brendan Turner told me to quit my job and just Burr method everything. And so I was like pretty close and ready to do that. And my wife was like, no way. Like, we have one property. We're barely making like $100 a month in cash flow. And I'm making close to six figures as an engineer. She's like, no way. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Had some mentors that were like, Adam, you're like 100 yards off of shore. I'm sure you could jump and you would probably turn out fine, but why not just wait 5 years, have a good foundation to slowly go part-time, which is what I did, and then eventually leave and be on good terms. And the amount of stress that is not there was just so much better. So it was like a 2-year transition period out of the W-2, because my best thing that I had is I could get debt financing and I made a lot of money. And so what I did have was time, and then I'd run out of capital. So it's like, okay, how do I get a return on investment and a return on my time invested? And so those were the two things that I hammered on the most for probably a 5-year period.
Wow. Thank you for taking us through that journey. I am hearing a couple of things, and one of them is just you seem to be drawn to influencing and inspiring others, which resonates with me because I am a PharmD by training. I work at a biotech company, and so that could be very technical. And I started on the medical side and actually transitioned over to the business strategy side. And I just know that this is my home on this side
Mm,
because I like to on the medical side, it is not your job to influence certain type of behavior. You're there to give objective information versus on the commercial side, we're set to try to help move product. And that to me is exciting. And that means that you have to influence and inspire other people. And it took me a bunch of one-on-ones early in my career. I sat down with anyone who was in a position that I was remotely interested in, and I asked them, what energizes versus drains you in your job?
mm.
And some people would say something that energizes them that I'm like, that does not sound exciting to me at all. Of course, I wouldn't say that to them, but I just knew in my own compass, like, okay. And that's how I knew I needed to make the transition out of medical into commercial. And so it sounds like you went on your own journey, whereas like this technical stuff, I can do it. And I'm obviously very educated and, this is within my purview, but I actually really enjoy taking it to another level and inspiring other people to buy or, make some decisions on behalf of our project. So it's cool that you found that in a kind of roundabout way, but it really brings it back to like what energizes versus drains you about the work that you're doing. So
Sure. And I would say I think for me, it's always trying to open up the next door. I think they call it the corridor principle,
Huh.
where I think I want to go through doors 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it's like, all you got to do is get through door number 1, because then you're in the lobby. And you're like, oh, turns out I didn't know that there was a 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D. And then once you get through that, like there's all these other doors. And so it's like, yes, you know what I want to do? Get into engineering and change the world and design all this stuff. I get into engineering. It's like, oh, well, it turns out now that I'm actually doing it and experiencing it, my specific skill sets then, and just as I mature, somewhat change. So I'm a big fan of doing things rather quickly and learning about them versus just like stewing, like, what I really should do is start my business. Go start a business and fail super fast, because you know what? It's kind of tough is just everyone has those ideas, or just like work. Hey, I'm thinking about getting into commercialization. I think it's the people that sit there and like, I don't know if I should do it. And they sit and they think about it for like a year or 5 years. And whether or not it's the right answer, typically that obstacle is the way. You might actually, you either need to confirm or deny you do not want to make that lateral or that change. Now, I wouldn't necessarily go, completely jump ships and have, things that are unrepairable, but it's like, okay, well, what's the minimum viable test that I can do to see if I can, be interested in that? Can I sit in on a meeting? Can I, have 10% of my time? But it is night and day difference when you wake up and you're like, what do I want to work on today? And you get that freedom to be like, these are the people that Adam and only Adam can uniquely help. There's somebody that I put into a house yesterday that only Adam and Home Equity Partner could have put into that house out of anybody on planet Earth. And so like that to me is super cool, versus if I was giving good water pressure to the entire city, no one calls me up and was like, hey, Adam, good job with the water pressure today. Like that shower was, awesome. For whatever reason in the civil engineering, I just didn't quite get the feedback loop. And maybe that's my words of affirmation, love language, speaking out. But for me, it was, who can Adam and only Adam uniquely help using my own unique gifts?
I love that. Can you tell us a little more about that little anecdote about putting that person into that house and why specifically Home Equity Partner, your business and you were the ones that were set up to do that?
Sure. So it came through a series of iterations where it started off extremely selfish. And and right now I kind of cringe thinking about it, because it's like, what did I want? I was like, I wanted time freedom. I wanted passive income. I wanted, X, Y, or Z. And it was like, well, should have I had that? Because it seems selfish, right? You're like, oh, what would be better? It's like, oh, if I solved world peace, or, gave drinking water. And it's like, I kind of wanted that initially, but I was like, it turns out if I was just being super honest, Adam wanted more time freedom. Like that was it. And like that was the thing that actually was the highest motivator. And it wasn't until I actually got more time freedom that I was like, oh, turns out that that's not the be all end all. And that's pretty selfish. Okay, now how do I set more generous goals? I'm very much in awe of individuals that both have a public serving entity and something else. So for me, it was just like, my wife and I are working 2 full-time jobs. We got young kids. Life is super stressful. How do I just stop the 5 o'clock? Everybody wants a break, witching hour. Supper needs to get done. My wife wants a break. I want a break. The kids just got home from daycare and they're going to scream because they've been holding in their emotions all day. And it's like, okay, how do I solve that pain? And it's like, and it was like a lot of pain for me internally, right? So it's like, okay, just solve that pain. Like, just get rid of that pain, right? So it's like, that was the primary motivator. And then once it's like, okay, I slowly started transitioning, and now it's part-time. Now my wife's part-time. Now it's this. And it's like, oh, turns out the edges, the morning routine, the evening routines are just that less stressful. So then it's like, okay, what's the next thing I want to optimize for? So it's like, once we got to about $6,000 a month, which was 60% of our income, we were like, okay, I think that's about time to segue away. But it came through like us just trying to buy properties, trying to fix and flip homes. We sucked at it, learned a bunch of lessons. Then I found partnerships. And then we found a unique model, which is rent to own. We essentially find someone who's 1 to 3 years away from a mortgage. We'll buy the home, or we'll find one of my engineering buddies to buy them a home. And then they'll sell them the home on a lease with an option to buy until they can secure traditional financing. So right now, what the company does is we just approve like dozens or hundreds of people to go pick a home listed for sale. Our company or our fund buys the home, the tenant moves in, and then they have a 3-year window to buy back the home. So we're trying to transform them from a renter to a homeowner. There's large companies like Home Partners of America or Divvy Homes that are doing this in the major metro. We're just doing this as a small piece of that, trying to help people. And at the same time, I found that it's a higher return on investment for investors for a less risk. So that was the model that kind of allowed us to accelerate in a faster manner. But we did probably 10 properties before this that was like turnkey, single family, try to Airbnb, try to rent by the room. And some of them had various levels of success, but it wasn't until I failed or did all of that other real estate that I was like, oh, it turns out I don't like turnover. I don't like, managing properties a whole lot. I can't find deals in my local backyard. So it slowly morphed into that.
Wow, that is so awesome. I'm just taking that all in. And another theme that is coming through is to take action. Like, don't get stuck in analysis paralysis. take massive action, which you did. It's what you were talking about, like going through the door, just like get through the next door and just really keep making the move so you can get a better understanding of what you like, what's working for you, what's not. And so I do want to go back to you started with a house hack and then you got your second property. So that was 2012, got the next property in 2016. What was the second property? Because you went from there and then over the span of like 7 years, bought like 40 plus properties. So that's a pretty fast scale. Was it primarily through this model that you just explained, or when did you switch to that model of placing people into their dream homes?
That was roughly 2020. So 2017, when we started ramping up, is when I found my business partner. I know some people don't like partnerships because, like, I don't know if I can get along. Dave Ramsey's like, the only ship that doesn't sail is a partnership. And I was like, well, what about marriage? Right. So it's like, I was like, I'm equally committed, not in the same way my marriage comes first, but it's like, if I'm giving my wife and my business partners the better end of the deal, I'm a big fan of 1+1 is something greater than two. So my business partner knows things that I don't. And so I am so blessed to have multiple business partners in multiple businesses. And for me, that was the biggest thing. You could double up capital, double up leverage, double up time. Cause like, that's what I didn't have. So he had capital, I had capital. I had some experience. He had some experience. He has contractor trades and qualities. I have more like engineering and analytical brains and like finances and lease and other stuff. So it's like we combined. So then in 2017, when we formed our first LLC, it was like, it's almost like my 5-year-old son running into someone in the playground. He's like, "Oh, you like Batman? I like Batman. Okay, let's be friends." And they're like, that was me and my buddy with real estate. He's like, "You know what? I've always been looking to do it." I was like, "Yeah, I got one. I'm looking to do more. I just bought my second one. Like, what if we formed an LLC?" And it was literally like a 1-page, like 7-bullet, like operating agreement, and we got into business together. And
How
then
did
it's
you
just
find
like,
each other? Like, what was the
um,
playground? Were you guys at a meetup, or how did you find him?
we were actually watching March Madness, 2017. He was a college friend. We had played basketball together, just kind of a mutual acquaintance. We were kind of just hanging out and kind of started talking about real estate. Like, hey, we should do this. And I've had partnerships that have gone well. I've had some that haven't. But if you have two individuals that just generally have good integrity and you're able to do that, it's so much easier to lighten the load. And I was like, yes, you're maybe giving up 50%, but even if you had 2 partners or 3 partners, like the amount of knowledge that the 3 of you can put together to not screw up, because I feel like that's what most businesses do is you kind of screw up or you have the wrong, capital investment or something like that. Like very rarely with 2 or 3 smart individuals are you going to make a bad investment. And so for me, it was the partnership that allowed us to kind of get started. And then through that, it was like, oh, turns out he's now taking more of the management. So now Adam gets to have new ideas, which is my favorite thing to do, which is like, how do we start a fund? How do we do rent to own? Let's look up Chris Cronin. Like, what the heck is a lease option? I've never even heard of it. What's a land contract? I was like, all of these new real estate terms that I could go on YouTube and learn and do other stuff while he was maybe running the business more so. And I was kind of, chasing shiny balls, sometimes good. 99 of them are dumb ideas, but every one Adam will bring back like a good idea. And so then it's like, oh, let's try this. And so the first thing we did was actually tell college kids, go pick out a house listed for sale. We'll buy it and rent it to you. Because what would happen on these major university campuses is all the houses around it were just terrible, like just terrible rentals and garbage. And college kids wanted houses, but there was no houses for rent near the campuses, but there'd sometimes be homes listed for sale. So we would just go we literally put up flyers and we started talking with college kids and we do like open houses at our other rentals and be like, hey, if you can't find a rental, just go pick any house on the MLS and pay the 1% rule. So if you find a $200,000 house, rent it for $2,000 a month. If you pick a $300,000 house, you'll pay $3,000 a month. You go do that, we'll buy the house for you. And so that was actually the very first model that we did just to get a few rentals. But then what would happen is they'd move out a year later and then market rent would be like 75% of that, which was still good. Like we got a property the same day we closed, they moved in. So there wasn't a bunch of vacancy. It was pretty good cash on cash return. But then after a year, like, oh, how do we do this? And it's like, oh, well, what if they did leave? So now we just do that same model, but with people, families, and individuals that can't quite have the credit, the debt to income, or are self-employed, where you just need someone who's like, I can get a bank loan in 2 seconds. Can you buy me this house? And then let's work out what sort of terms that looks like.
Wow. So it makes sense that you would go to, say, a college campus and find those students, but now how are you finding those people who want to buy a home? And yeah, where is it online market? Like, how do you find them?
Yeah, so there's 6 million people that are denied a mortgage each year. And there's 50,000 people searching rent to own homes into Google every month. And so we just tap into those two streams, whether it's loan officers and real estate agents that want to get someone into a home but can't. But primarily it's like Google ads, Facebook ads, because you just tap into that stream of 50,000 people searching rent to own homes, hoping that there's existing inventory. And we just say, hey, we don't have any homes, but what if we just bought you the house?
Wow. And is that how you got into 13 different markets? It was
Yep.
kind of
Now I think
driven.
we're in 20 states. I'm approaching about 100 single family homes, and it's I love doing it.
That is so, so cool. I just love the model and, it's a testament to if you wanna go fast, go alone. If you wanna go far, go together, and you did that in your partnership, but you're also doing it for these people who want the American dream of owning their own home. So what a cool business model. I actually admittedly didn't know that that's what you were doing coming into this, but that's just so beautiful. I really, really am inspired by this. When you were first getting out, everybody talks about bigger pockets, but you were getting these different ideas to try like Airbnb, short term, long term, whatever it was that you were testing out with these different purchases or purchasing. What am I saying? Doing with buying different properties. And so, what resources were you leveraging, or where was there a mentor? How were you getting all of your knowledge?
Sure. So the first direct question on how I was getting the knowledge, it was all like I just consumed a bunch of free stuff. It was podcasts, it was, audiobooks, it was going to the library, and it's like at the gym, in between time, driving in the car, it was just consuming books. And it started off with a lot of mindset ones. Then you'd sprinkle in some real estate ones, and it's like kind of the more traditional way, but it's like, man, I was just eating up all the stuff. Cause I was like, oh, this is just, I've never heard anyone talk like this before, like Dale Carnegie talked like this before. And it's just like all the people like feel like they're, basically reading a page out of my diary, right? All my internal thoughts that I wouldn't tell anybody else. And someone has articulated this like extremely well. And so it's like you start going through all that. And then it was like, I remember spending, I think it was $197 a month, which was my very first mastermind. It was a group called Total Life Freedom by Vincent Puglisi. And all it was for people that wanted to be entrepreneurs. And I was like, this is cool. So then I got into a room, a Zoom meeting, and then some live events where I was like, oh, I was actually talking with people. Cause like I would kind of bring it up to my engineering friends and they'd be like, nah, I'm kind of good. And I was like, oh, I'm envious of that. Like they're just like, yeah, I like my job and life's good. And I was like, I don't know, I'm just wired differently, right? I want a different level of wealth and happiness in my family that is about 10x what anybody else would normally want in my normal circle. Now, everyone's about 100x what I'm currently doing. So it's like I'm surrounding myself by people doing, much greater things. So there's this thief of joy if I'm comparing myself to, others, which is never a healthy version of it. But it was a lot of that. And then it was like just strategic bets. Like if I can pay $20 to get into a community, the amount of knowledge and experience in that community that you're paying $20 to get into is way more than free. There's just something about like, if I gave you Rich Dad, Poor Dad, you're like, maybe it's good. But if you bought Rich Dad, Poor Dad for $10, all of a sudden now, like that means so much more because you invested $10. Like you're going to read that book so much more intensely. And so the same thing with anything that you're like looking to get involved with. And so I'm all about, especially when you're starting off, like what's the lowest amount of capital that I can deploy that's the best return? Because there's $1, $10, $100, $1,000, $10,000, levels of investments that you can do. So I started off definitely free as much as I could. And then I started dabbling in $50 a month, an Audible subscription, a mastermind here, a mastermind there. Now I'm in 4 or 5 masterminds, pay to do different things. And so like, but now I have, a different level of financial, capability to be able to do that, to be able to, kind of grow. And so that was kind of where I invested the time. But I think what I first started off with was, what is my unique gift? I feel like everyone is sitting on some unfair advantage. Is it like who you know? Is it your specific skill set? Is it somebody, in your like premise, like you maybe know your local area better than someone else? And so I feel like if I say that, instantly a light bulb goes off in someone's head where they're like, ooh, I think I have an unfair advantage because of reasons X, Y, or Z. And it's usually a skill set, a location, or who they know. And it's like, sometimes you don't realize how unfair of an advantage it is to be living where you are, or to know the people that you are, or have the social capital of what you have. I think most people are like, oh, I want this, or I don't have that. But it's like, just think about exactly what you have and lean into that. And that's typically the least path of resistance. At least that's what I found.
You're making me think because, I'm into multifamily syndication and trying to make my way as like, what do I contribute to a team? And capital raising, while that can't be your only function, is something that I think I could be good at. However, it's one thing to inspire people on a general level and another to ask them to wire funds to, a project. And I look forward to the opportunity to get to do that because if I am actually trying to influence that type of behavior, I have to be really a big believer in the project. So, it's truly presenting an opportunity. But it sounds like, have you done capital raising and do you have any advice or ways to break through some self limiting thoughts or beliefs in order to be more effective at that?
I've done a lot of capital raising, not large dollar amounts, but probably from maybe 30 individuals, maybe raising 4 million through that. So it's and
That's not little.
so I mean, it started off with just like little small, like unsecured loans on real estate stuff, like friends and family type stuff, which just is like, that's a lot of times the easiest place to get it. Like, who do I know that like, hey, I firmly believe that if you give me 50 grand, I can give you 60 grand back. And it's like, if I can't do that, like, that there something else is the problem. So if you can't find a deal or if you can't network, if you can't get an actual return to investors, like there's nothing to bring towards them. But I remember being coached early on. It was like, you don't ask for anything, right away. It's like, just share what you're doing with as many people as you can. And then typically they're asking for you. And it's like the book Never Eat Alone. It's like, yeah, you want to strengthen those bonds way before you ask someone for something. So it's like, well, who in your network can you help? And a lot of it's just sometimes connecting A to C and you're B. And that's it. Like, you just like, oh, someone wants to talk with someone about whole life, insurance. Like, oh, I have a person for that. And so if you can kind of build a network or be able to serve other people, then when comes time to ask, that's a big thing where you've actually built trust. And it's hard because I was like, they're like, what's your track record? And at the beginning, it's like, oh, I don't really have a track record. So that's like a really hard objection, probably internally and externally, to get over. But it's like, okay, well, how do you present it? How do you package it? And that's where the deal sometimes has to overcome, or the partners or other things that sometimes have to overcome the lack of being able to have that social capital or the track record, because a lot of times people are looking to do that, but typically friends, family, close investors, other people that kind of know what you're doing. And so that's why I started small and single family. I was like, hey, I did this, made some money, like at least there. Or if you can share your LinkedIn profile with someone, like, oh, someone's actually, you're employable, someone can stand to marry you, you have kids, like you're not in dire rains, like, hey, you at least have some amount of social proof around you, which oftentimes helps more than you think. If you just have a professionalism, if you're making six figures and you got a decent credit score, it's like, okay, that's sometimes better than 95% of the other people that are trying to raise capital.
Huh. Okay, giving me a little boost of confidence here. But okay, so you and your wife were able to get it to a place where you're netting $6,000 a month or, whatever that goal might be for the listener, and the listener typically has, maybe six figures and wants to have more of that time freedom. What might you say is the fastest way? Because I'm sensing you've tried a lot of, or you've done a lot of different strategies. So what would your best advice be for somebody who wants to maybe even just go part-time sooner than later?
So I'm going to segue this as to part A and part B. Part
Okay.
A is get really, really good at your job and optimizing your time in your job. I know some employees have to like literally work like X amount of hours. You have to be here at 8 or 5. I completely went against the grain and I was like, hey, if I can do these results, like what are the actual results that you care about? Is it billable hours? Is it number of sales brought in? Is it like customers? Is it interaction? And then I was like, how do I get as many systems, automations, VAs, other people to help me do that job so I can actually optimize? Because like once you're making six figures, like paying someone else $10 an hour is like almost nothing, or even $20 an hour, right? Because you're billing out at like 70 or 100 or 250 an hour. And so it's like, if they're a third of your time, it's like, okay, how many of those things without breaking security or protocol or whatnot, it's like optimize for your time. So it's like, oh, how do you get the most amount of work done the most efficiently? And don't even think about investing or all the other stuff. It was literally just like, you can't optimize for that unless this part. Because if you're working 60 hours a week and it's never ending, there's literally nothing else to get rid of. And so for me, part A was like, okay, what are the non-negotiables that my job needs from me? What does my boss expect from me? And is there a way I can do that results oriented? So if I'm sending emails at 5 o'clock in the morning, but I don't show up until the office at 10 a.m., is that okay? Some people it might be, some people it's not. It's like, hey, if I go to city council meetings and sell $500,000 of work, is it okay if I don't have 40 hours of billable labor this time? And so for me, it was like kind of setting those expectations to optimize actually for that. Cause now it's like, oh, I'm actually doing stuff I enjoy, and I'm now working closer to 40 to 45 hours a week instead of like 60 trying to be the CEO of the company. So for me, it was like optimizing for that, even though I did, have ambitions of being the CEO. So then it was like, once you optimize that, I then did the same thing personally, like the nanny, hiring out, the cooking, the lawn mowing, like literally, I went so far into the 4-hour work week. It wasn't even funny. I was like trying to outsource, like not this would be a little bit tongue in cheek because I never did this, but like outsourcing time with my wife, right? If I could have, like at that point, I was like so on board with like outsource. That was like, I didn't want to pick up a hammer, didn't want to fix a toilet, didn't want to touch the lawn because it was all just, it was either I was an engineer, I was a real estate, or I was a family man. And there was literally no other time for anything else. It cut off social media, cut off friends, cut off other things. So it was like potentially to an unhealthy level, but it was like I was all in on that. Like I wasn't golfing, I wasn't disc golfing, like maybe every now and then, like very randomly, but it was like all into that. It's like personal development, miracle morning, get stuff done, early in the morning. So then once it was like kind of optimizing for that on the personal side, along with the work side, then I was like, okay, how do I get the velocity of money the fastest? What's the highest ROI? Because for me, I didn't necessarily want wealth at the beginning. I wanted cash flow. Long term, I want wealth, but to free up my time, it was actually more cash flow than it was wealth. So for me, it was like, okay, how do I get the most amount of cash flow? So that's where I was looking on like true cash on cash ROI versus maybe a long term, like over 30 years, you'll have this. Like, great, those are two, perfectly good things. But yeah, if you can, whether it's flipping houses, whether you can lend money, whether you can, buy properties and get higher cash flow and an Airbnb or different things. So like for me, it was like, I wanted a 20% cash on cash ROI because for me, the 10% just wasn't going to get me there fast enough. When I first started, even if it got close to 10%, I was buying it. But then once you can only put 20% down so many times, then you're like, oh, I'm out of money. And so it's like, okay, well, now if I only got 25K, if I get a 20% return, well, now that money doubles every 3 years instead of every 7 years. And so it's like, okay, well, how do I continue to juice the ROI on the money, because that's going to be the highest way to get the cash on cash return that'll buy back my time, which can segue into wealth. So that was a long answer to your short question.
That was a perfect answer because it does chunk it out into segments for me now. It's like part A, optimize your time at work, at home, etc. Then part B, it's cash flow. And then part C is the wealth generating. So it does make it a little more organized in my brain, at least. I'm curious what type of transactions were you doing that are getting 20% cash on cash return?
So
I mean,
that's
you might have already spoken to it, but
yeah. So that's really when we went college kid route.
I
That's when
see.
we were buying turnkey properties that would sometimes it was older houses, or if you can buy a 3-bedroom and rent out the 4th room. And so for me, it wasn't like it had to be a good enough deal. Sometimes you can do some flips or some burrs that'll get you that high, cash on cash. So those were the ones that we were looking at getting that self-managing everything to start with, because it was like, a property manager can do it. And generally I'd be all for outsourcing it because I'm like pro 4-hour work week. But I was coached also early on, like, hey, you got to learn those first ones, because otherwise, like, no one's going to care as much as you do. And it's such a good learning experiences on your first, 3 properties that you're learning. And since I was in a single family space and they're in my backyard, it was a lot easier to do. So I could juice the returns because I was calling the repair person, or I was collecting rent, and then I could also get higher rent. So it wasn't until I started segueing into that college, into partnering on flip deals, to then, the lease to own, that we were now targeting that for kind of a minimum investment of what we're looking to do now.
That is so cool. I just love how organized it feels, probably more in retrospect, but the path to get there, I mean, you took a lot of action just to make it possible. So kudos to you.
On the
So, oh, go ahead.
on the flip side, if I may, I am paying my dumb tax on my single worst decision I've ever made as a real estate investor, which I will lose probably $120,000 on.
Oh
And
no.
so for all the good ones, right? So there, there's maybe 99 good ones, like for taking massive action. It's like, you don't want that to be your first one. But like for what I did is I partnered with someone in Texas. They didn't do their end. We ended up paying contractors the wrong thing, got into a bunch of properties that were nowhere near what they were. I was underwater. So I basically had to pay them off. And now it's like, I've had these properties, I think for 2.5 years, still haven't sold them. And so it's like time, money, whatnot, will like eat into this little town in Texas. That's just the nemesis of me, that's like this property that I can't get rid of. And I was like, you know what? This is like one of the greatest lessons that I've learned. And it's like, for all of like, there's no way Adam's going to bat 1,000 going for single family homes, and being able to stomach a 6-figure loss is like super painful. And I don't really want to do it, ever again. But it's like, I learned a $5,000 lesson, a $10,000 lesson, and now a $100,000 lesson of like what not to do. So I'm like, okay, well, now the next mistake I'm going to make is $1 million, which, if I'm just following order of magnitude, but that means I'll have at least the capacity of making $1 million mistake, to which, I currently can't make right now because I don't have that much, influence. But then maybe my next mistake will be $10 million. And so it's like, all it was just stacking failures. But at the same time, you're also stacking up the wins of like, oh, you know what I'm never going to do again?
Yeah.
X, Y, Z, A, B, C. And so if you can start by making $1, $10, and $100 risks, they feel much better than a 6-figure risk. But it's like, there's gotta be some sort of calculated risk to return. And so for me, I'm always just trying to get like a 3-to-1 reward to risk. Like heads I win, tails I break even. If that was like my general philosophy, like that's what I want. I want to like, either yes, this is going to work, or like I'll get my money back and I'll lose some time.
Yeah. Well, can we pull out some of those $100,000 lessons? So when you think about partnering and just thinking back, because you said you've had some good ones, you've had some maybe not so good ones. There's this one multifamily investor, Rod Cleef, who always says, when he was married, he said, I'd always bring my wife to dinner with a potential partner because she just picks up like with her instincts on things that I wouldn't pick up on. And I've heard that now from a couple of investors, but do you have any ways of vetting your potential partnerships?
Yep, I do it the same way with employees. I give them at least three trip tests. So like we'll meet, anytime you meet someone, it's always like, oh, the butterflies are great. We should have coffee. Like, let's be best friends, right? Because it's like you barely know each other. You don't know, what they're good at, what they're bad at. But it's like, it's always kind of, a little bit business partnership, like love at first sight. Like, oh, I could raise money. Oh, I could find deals. Oh, let's be friends forever. And it's like, rarely does that work. Like maybe 1 in a million. But what I've found is like, okay, wait a week and give them a task to do and see if they do it. And it's like that to me, if I just give you a basic task of like, hey, like, if I have an employee, they're like, hey, Adam, can I pick your brain? And I want to join Home Equity Partner. I'm like, cool, take this DISC personality assessment and send it to me. If they don't do that, I never have a conversation with them again. And it's like, if they could be like, oh, sorry, I missed it. Or, the deadline passed. Well, I was like, that's pretty easy. So if they do that, then right, okay, now it's the next one. Go try to get told no 10 times. I don't care what it is. Get told no 10 times. Try to sell something 10 times, which is really hard. I guess this is an example for a salesperson, but it's like, give them the next test that's like a little bit uncomfortable and just like see if they'll do it. And so for me, it's setting up like 3 different almost tripwires of like, if they don't do it, and I kind of staggered it out over a week, a month, or over a 3-month period, in addition to kind of some other small things. But in my mind, it was like basically dating before you get engaged, before you get business married. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
how do we date? Okay. And if you want to partner, okay, date, get to know each other, do a joint venture on your first deal. Don't form an LLC unless, unless the LLC is only for one deal. But it's like, oh, how might we do a joint venture? In the single family, it's really easy, right? So I fund people's flips. Somebody finds the deal, I'll fund it 100% and we'll split the profits 50-50. That's another, business model that I have. But it's like, let's do one deal. Okay, if that deal goes well, okay, now let's do, maybe 3, versus like, ooh, let's flip this LLC. I'll put in $500,000. Let's go do 10 homes. Because I've tried that where you're like, you got this grand vision. You want to do X, Y, or Z. And yes, you have to have similar vision. But I found that through a 90-day period and actually like going back and forth with like tasks and expectations on how you work with someone is a way better way of getting to know someone and whether or not you enjoy working with them or whether or not there's someone you want to work with. Because there's a lot of people that'll say, hey, Adam, can I pick your brain? and you give them like a little small test to see if they're willing to do any sort of work to, you know, gain something. And a lot of them just want it, but they're not willing to do the work. And so trying to chase away some wannabes, you know, on the business partnership and along with just, you know, vendors or contractors in general.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it sounds like a really effective filter. How important are family or not just family values, but general, I guess, personal values and lining those up?
It's a on our wall, we have my wife's top 5 values, my top 5 values, and then our shared family values in the middle. And it goes red, blue, green. And so I can see, I always thought it was a little bit weird. I was like, well, I have my own top 3 values, which are growth, legacy, and righteousness. My wife's top 3 values, which are family, security, and tradition. So you can see how there's some, you can either say they're clashing or they're complementary, is how I like to say it, right? Because my wife doesn't like risk, and I definitely like so growth and, you know, security kind of clash a little bit. And then in the middle, we got faith, family, and fitness, where it's like, okay, individually we have our own values, which is like where we value things the most, but then as a family, this is what we value. And so from the family aspect of things, and as our kids grow up, we're going to add them right on the side. So this is Ava, this is Logan, this is William's, you know, personal values. And so right now my daughter has her 5 up right now, and what her top 5 values are on what you're doing. In business, we have the same thing where we follow EOS, like the traction, where we got the, you know, the top 5 values. Those aren't as powerful as my personal ones, because I'm such a big believer in values. And on the business one, we're, you know, 6 of us from a company standpoint, so it's not super huge. So I don't use those, you know, as religiously in the business, but on the personal side, man, it's so huge.
Yeah, I like that you are so clear on them because I imagine asking a potential partner, like I've read the traction book and, I'm familiar with EOS, but if you say like, what are your values? It could be, one word it could be the right word, but then to know and see them live that is a
Mhm.
different thing. And so I appreciate just the background. It is a component of knowing whether you'd be a fit for business marriage. Um so okay, we're coming up on a close here and I've got a few more questions left for you. One of them is, you mentioned at the very top how important time freedom has become for you and you get to do some special things with your kids. But do you have any other hobbies or ways that you like to spend your now freer time?
Sure. So in general, I follow a rule, the 5 4 3 2 1 rule, which is 50 40 30 20 10, which is the amount of hours in a week. So it's 50 hours of sleep, 40 hours of work, 30 hours of family time, 20 hours of Adam time, and then 10 hours to use where I think is the most needed. And so that's, maybe it's sleep, maybe it's work, maybe it's family. And so for me, I've actually found that that sort of a framework actually gives me the most amount of freedom, where it's almost like that framework gives Adam freedom, right? Because if I go too far, one way or another, if I'm gone for a week from the family, like that doesn't fit that ecosystem, but I still get 3 hours a day roughly to myself. I'm still spending 30 hours a week with the family, and I get 40 hours to do the things that Adam feels like I really want to do. And so when I do get my own personal time, it's like, so a lot of it is like disc golf, going outside, going to the gym. I really value that a lot. And now, as I'm slowly starting to build back up like social capital, I like getting out into the woods. I like doing things outside, and I like doing things as an extrovert with friends, getting away for a weekend. Those would be the things that fill Adam's cup.
I appreciate you calling out that we tend to compromise some of our social connections as we build this out for our families, for ourselves. And, it is a lot juggling a W 2, your family, and becoming a business owner, entrepreneur. So it's reassuring. Because I'm reading Brendan Burchard's High Performance Habits, I'm being a lot more deliberate about my connections because they do fill my cup and re-energize me. But now I'm looking at my weekend coming up and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I have so many social commitments. I want to just like, rest and not really do anything other than play with the kids and chill."
Yes.
But I know that I'm going to come out of it feeling really happy that I spent some time with friends I haven't seen in a long time. So,
There's one category of friends. Yeah, I have like growth friends, and they can be like, oh, we're doing this, and I'm going to learn something, and we're going to troubleshoot, and we'll do this. And then I have my laugh friends, high school friends, people where I have like almost zero values in, but they just make Adam laugh. And it's
hey,
like,
I
let's
like
get
that.
on a golf course, and we're just going to laugh. And I was like, you know what? That's a good. those are good people to have in your life.
And you need both. I like that you're saying
Yeah.
you've got growth and laugh friends. Somebody else framed it as you have friends who might say, remember when? And then you have some friends, your growth friends, who would say, imagine if. And like
Mhm.
those ones really excite you and,
Yeah, that's a good way.
all the different ways you want to grow. So, you mentioned that so at the beginning, you scaled out to 50 and now you're approaching 100 units. And is there a done for the project team or like what does done look like? Are you going to just keep going and for as long as there's need, which there always will be, of people who want to own their own home, is this just going to be the forever business model or do you see yourself having some form of done in the future?
There's a personal financial goal that we set forth 10 years ago that was like X amount passive income per month. And like that still is like, it was like the first number I read on a card. And it was like, once I get to that, that'll feel like a very done moment of like, hey, with this passive number, like you can pretty much do a lot of things. But even with that, when you have like, I have no time, now I have a bunch of time. Sometimes you can have a little bit of identity crisis. You're like, okay, well, now what? Who am I going to serve? What's the best use of Adam's time? And so there's that reminder that goes off in my phone that says, hey, Adam, who are you and only you uniquely qualified to help? And just pondering and thinking about that question, there's just something about me that's like, I desperately want to help someone unique. So what we are building with that, the state of North Dakota actually gave us a grant to build out a legit rent to own marketplace. So, how in Zillow, you can search for sale or for rent. We're
Yeah.
going to eventually build something that's for rent to own with the idea of giving renters equity into homes and investors having properties that are being sold on rent to own. So it's not just so one-sided with investors having all the equity and tenants having none, to try to help with some home affordability options.
Wow, that is so cool. I will follow up with you. I want to know when that launches or when we can is it going to be a website that folks can use to
Yeah, it's going to
browse?
end up being zegacy.com. So it is
Zegacy.
the Zoc legacy. So Zegacy. So zegacy.com.
I like it. Zoc Legacy, Zegacy. Very, very cool. So thank you for that was one of the questions that I had to close with, which was, where can we find you online? Any date that we should start looking for Zegacy.com?
So we're gonna the website's probably live right now, if depending on when listeners are listening to this. So we're about the middle of July. So we're gonna be continuously improving, but you'll have to bear with us. If you want to join now, it's completely free. So anyone that wants to join, eventually they'll have some sort of price attached to it. But the whole goal is we're gonna build up lists of investors and tenants on both sides. And then the more that we have, the more users and interactions. And I just feel like rent to own's got a bad rap. You got people being taken advantage of, mostly investors taking advantage of tenants where they get a down payment and they kick them out or they don't have sort of equity. So having a legit area where I've done 7 of these personally and knowing how to orchestrate these across the United States is just one thing that I feel extremely uniquely qualified to help some individuals and to legitimize it in a fair and transparent way for both sides, so that it's a win-win.
I love this, and it brings it all back to that question you had was what are you uniquely qualified to do to help a person with? That's
That's right.
so inspiring. Anywhere else that we can find you online?
So right now, if you want to go to homeequitypartner.com, you can kind of check out what we're doing. And then I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook. I have yet to get on the Instagram or the TikTok. So right now, Adam's sweet spot is LinkedIn and Facebook.
LinkedIn and Facebook. All right, you heard it here. Adam, thank you so much for your time. I'm really inspired by what you're doing, and you sound like just an incredible business person, but also an incredible family man, and or actually that first, right? So, thank you for spending the time with me today. I'm really excited about what's coming for you, and I can't wait to browse legacy.com.
Thank you. And if I may, the one last note is for all the parents out there that are, I call it, sometimes I use the same analogy of investing in your kids when they're young. Having now a 6, almost 7-year-old, it's so awesome. So if you have young kids, like being there for them, investing in them, just like watching them emotionally, it's like sometimes it's tough to know between 0 and 5, like how much of that is like getting through consciously versus like subconsciously. And it's like how much, with your time interacting, just because, their memory or different things isn't there. But it is so worth it, having talked with other dads. And so the more you can invest in time and have that time to invest in your kids early on, I can already start to see and reap the benefits of it, of just the emotional and social connection with the kids. So although it's tough to balance work and, personal, time and family. Just the words of encouragement of those that are in the thick of it, as I like to call it, where you got 3 young kids and sleep is tough and getting to the gym or taking care of yourself, it is difficult. That, to me, that's something worth suffering for.
Yeah. Yes. You're speaking to me, and it's just making me that much more clear about how I want to spend my evening. Because when you were talking about that 5 o'clock hour where it's like you bring the kids home from daycare, preschool, and you just feel so exhausted, but you want to give them your all and be really imaginative and playful, it re-energizes that for me. So thank you for ending on that note. That's really special.
Thank you for having me. This is wonderful.
Thanks, Adam.
Today's episode was sponsored by Matrix Arch Capital. And you can find me on Instagram at Amanda the Investor. Send me a message. I'd love to hear from you.